Buy or rent? The decision that could shape your financial future. For decades, we've heard the same simple advice. Renting is just throwing your money away. Buy a home, build wealth, and eventually own a valuable asset. What if that advice no longer works for everyone? In many cities, home prices have risen much faster than incomes. Mortgage costs have increased, and for many families, the dream of homeownership has become harder to reach. The real question isn't whether buying is better than renting, it's which choices. Given your financial situation, the housing market, interest rates, and the opportunity cost of your money will put you in a better position over the long term. Because buying a home is about more than just the price tag, and renting is about more than just the monthly payment. Behind both choices, there are costs that aren't always obvious at first. And that's where the real buy versus rent decision begins. Buying or renting. What does each really give you? What do you actually get when you buy a home? First of all, ownership. With every mortgage payment, you gradually build equity in an asset you own. And if the property increases in value over time, your wealth can grow with it. But the benefits aren't only financial. Homeownership can provide security and stability. You no longer have a landlord who can sell the property, raise your rent, or ask you to move, but that security comes at a cost. Buying a home requires significant upfront capital, creates long-term debt, and comes with expenses such as mortgage interest, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs. And of course, a large portion of your money becomes tied up in one property for years. So, what does renting give you? Its biggest advantage is flexibility. If your job, income, or personal circumstances change, you can generally move more easily. But that flexibility has costs too. Rental agreements usually last for a specific period. And when the lease ends, you may decide to renew or move somewhere else. Over the years, a renter may move several times. And each move can mean moving expenses, a new security deposit, and other costs. By contrast, someone who buys a home and stays for the long term may remain in the same property for many years, spreading those moving costs over a much longer period. But one major difference remains. At the end of a rental, the tenant doesn't own the home. A homeowner, on the other hand, may eventually own the property outright once the mortgage is fully paid. But getting there can require decades of payments, and the total cost can be far higher than the price you see on the listing. So, which is better, buying or renting? There is no universal answer. Home prices, income, mortgage rates, how long you plan to stay, rental costs, and most importantly, what you do with your capital can all change the outcome. And that's where the real question begins, because the price you see on a home is only the beginning of the calculation. Why is the price of a home only the beginning? One useful rule of thumb can help us think about this, the 5% rule. But this is not a fixed law or an official standard. It's simply a rough way to estimate the unrecoverable costs of owning a home. As a simple estimate, we can think of roughly 5% of a home's value each year as representing these costs. They can include things like property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs, and the opportunity cost of the capital tied up in the home. But the actual number can vary significantly from one market to another and from one home to another. So 5% is not a universal rule, but it can help us make a simple comparison. Let's assume a home is worth $500,000. 5% of that is $25,000 a year, or roughly $2,080 a month. This doesn't mean the homeowner will literally spend $25,000 every year. It's simply a rough estimate of costs that don't necessarily build equity in the home. Now imagine you could rent a similar home for significantly less. In that case, renting may become more attractive financially. But if the rent is roughly equal to the unrecoverable costs of owning, or even higher, buying may become more attractive. And that brings us to an important question. Is the price of a home reasonable compared with the rent you could pay for it? That question leads us to another important concept, the price to rent ratio. Price to rent. Is the home really overpriced? One simple way to examine a housing market is to compare the price of a home with the rent it could generate. The idea is simple. How many years of rent is the purchase price equivalent to? Imagine a home priced at $500,000 with annual rent of $50,000. The purchase price is equivalent to about 10 years of rent. Now imagine that same home. It is priced at $1 million, while the annual rent remains $50,000. Now the ratio becomes 20. The purchase price is equivalent to 20 years of rent. The higher this number becomes, the more expensive the home is relative to the rent it generates. And in that situation, renting may become more financially attractive. When the ratio is lower, buying may become more attractive. But this is only a guide, not a final answer, because the price to rent ratio doesn't tell us everything. We still need to consider mortgage rates, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, transaction costs, and the opportunity cost of the money tied up in the home. And that brings us to one of the most important questions in this entire debate. What else could your money be doing? If you don't put your money into a home, where could it grow instead? Imagine you have $100,000 available for a home purchase. You could use it as a down payment and put that money into the property. Or you could invest that capital somewhere else. For example, in a diversified stock portfolio, a business, or other assets, depending on your goals and risk tolerance. This is called opportunity cost. It is the value of what you give up when you choose one option over another. And there is an important catch. Renting by itself is not an investment strategy. You free up $100,000 by not buying a home and then spend that money on a new car, vacations, or other consumption. The opportunity disappears. But if you actually invest that capital, and when possible, invest the difference between your monthly housing costs, the equation can change dramatically. Of course, investing also comes with risks, taxes, fees, and market volatility. There are no guaranteed returns. So the real comparison isn't simply buying versus renting. It is buying versus renting plus investing. And now we can ask the question that really matters. 5 years from now, who will be wealthier, the homeowner or the renter who invested? The answer isn't as simple as it sounds. Let's put the idea into practice. Imagine two people with similar incomes, savings, and financial circumstances. Let's call them Alex and Sam. Alex buys a home. He puts $100,000 down and takes out a mortgage for the rest. Every month, he makes his mortgage payment while also paying property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and other ownership costs. Sam chooses to keep renting. Instead of putting $100,000 into a down payment, he invests it. And if his monthly housing costs are lower than Alex's, he invests the difference as well. Now, fast forward 5 years. Alex owns a home that may have increased in value. He has also paid down part of his mortgage, building equity along the way. But he has also paid interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, and other costs that don't necessarily increase his equity. Sam doesn't own the home, but his investments may have grown. He has also avoided many of the costs associated with owning the property. So who has built more wealth? Alex, the homeowner, or Sam, the renter and investor? The answer depends on what happened over those 5 years. Home prices, rent, mortgage rates, investment returns, and the costs of owning the home can all change the result. And there's one more variable we cannot ignore: inflation. Because the number on your bank statement and the real purchasing power of that money are not always the same thing. Before we calculate who actually came out ahead, we need to understand how inflation changes the equation. How can inflation and interest rates change the outcome? Let's go back to Alex. Suppose he has a fixed rate mortgage. His monthly principal and interest payments are largely fixed, even though the prices of goods and services may continue to rise. Imagine Alex has a mortgage rate of 5% while inflation is running at 10%. That doesn't mean Alex is earning 5% or that inflation is giving him a 5% profit. But it does mean that over time, the real purchasing power burden of his fixed debt can decline. In other words, Alex may be repaying a fixed amount of debt with money that is worth less in real terms than it was when he borrowed it. And if the value of his property also rises, his financial position may become more attractive. But there is another side. If Alex has a much higher mortgage rate, The cost of borrowing can consume a large part of the potential return from the property. And if home prices don't rise or even fall, high financing costs can become a serious burden. Now look at Sam. Sam benefits when his investments generate returns that outpace inflation while also keeping up with rising living costs and rent. If his investments grow faster than inflation, his wealth can increase in real terms. But if his investments fail to keep up with inflation, his purchasing power can gradually decline. So inflation doesn't automatically make one person the winner. And neither does a rising housing market. The real question is, which set of numbers works better for you? Alex may win if his financing costs are manageable, his property performs well, and his ownership costs remain under control. Sam may win if his investments generate strong real returns and his rent remains manageable. And that brings us to the final step. How should you decide? After looking at ownership costs, price to rent, opportunity cost, inflation, and interest rates, how do you apply all of this to your own life? There's no universal formula, but 3 questions can help. What is the price to rent ratio in your market? A very high ratio may indicate that buying is expensive relative to renting. A lower ratio can make buying more attractive. But remember, it is a guide, not a rule. 2, how does your mortgage rate compare with inflation? If you can borrow at a relatively favorable fixed rate and the property performs well over time, buying may make financial sense. But expensive borrowing can dramatically increase the true cost of ownership. And remember, inflation itself is not a guaranteed benefit. What matters is how inflation interacts with your debt, your income, your property value, and your other investments. 3, what will you do with the money you don't put into a home? This may be the most important question of all. If you choose to rent, will you actually invest the capital you have freed up? Will you invest the difference in monthly housing costs? Or will that money simply disappear into everyday spending? Because renting can only become a powerful financial strategy if the money you save actually works for you. And buying can also be a powerful financial decision if the cost of ownership fits your income, your market, your risk tolerance, and your long-term plans. Buying a home is not always the smartest financial decision, and renting is not automatically throwing money away. The right choice depends on your numbers, your financial behavior, your goals, and the market you live in. So don't buy simply because society tells you renting is throwing money away, and don't rent simply because someone says investing is always better than owning a home. Look at the numbers, understand the opportunity cost, consider the risks, and ask yourself one final question. Where can my money work harder for me? Because the real question isn't simply, where should I live? It's, what should my money be doing while I live there? The best financial decision isn't the same for everyone. It's the one that makes sense for you.